What I want to ask tonight and examine is, what is it? How did he create them? What were his sort of internal rules? And what does he do to lift us up and make us laugh and make us cry and make us think and make us examine ourselves in a comic way, in a way that lifts us up, that obviously 2/3 of his output doesn't do? What is special about the comedies, and how did he do it?
Tonight's speaker is Ken Ludwig. Ken Ludwig is a 2-time award-winning playwright whose work is performed throughout the world in more than 30 countries and over 20 languages. He has written 24 plays and musicals, with 6 Broadway productions and 7 in London's West End. His critically acclaimed adaptation of Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express premiered this season to sold-out houses at the McCarter Theater in Princeton, and his newest play, Robin Hood, opens this August at the Old Globe. He has received commissions from the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Old Globe, and is a Sally B. Goodman Fellow at the McCarter Theater. His book, How to Teach Your Children Shakespeare, won the Falstaff Award for his best Shakespeare book, and his essays are published by the Yale Review. Ken's plays and musicals are produced somewhere in the United States and abroad every night of the year. And Trident Booksellers is here with us this evening for a selling and signing following tonight's lecture. Please join me in welcoming Ken Ludwig.
Is that better? Great, great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back in Boston. And I thank Rebecca and the Boston Public Library for inviting me. I lived in the Boston area for 3 years. For whatever crazy reason, I went to Harvard Law School. But while I was there, I met Leonard Bernstein, who was preparing the Norton Lectures at the time. And he convinced me that I was an artist at heart, and what the hell was I doing studying law. He said, why don't you join my seminar in musical theater, which I did. And it is thanks to Leonard Bernstein that I have probably the lowest grade point average in the history of Harvard Law School, but I graduated. Let me start with a little known fact about Massachusetts. In the summer of 1779, John Adams was appointed by the Massachusetts legislature to be the sole author of the state's constitution. He went to Braintree that summer. He wrote it all out. Well, I don't have the page, but I can remember it anyway. He wrote out the Constitution for Massachusetts. And he included in Section 2, Chapter 6, an article that had never before been included in a constitution. And what it said is that the legislators, after writing about that the legislature should consist of this and the judiciary of this, he said that the legislators and the magistrates are charged with cherishing literature and science. Their job was one of their jobs was to cherish literature. And it's the first time that any such a section has ever been included in a constitution, as far as I know, and I don't think anyone up to that time and forever since. So it's thanks to John Adams, and hooray for John Adams in Massachusetts, and for the Boston Public Library for allowing us to spend an hour together to cherish one of John Adams's greatest heroes, and that was William Shakespeare. He and Jefferson visited Stratford on one of their many trips together throughout when they were in England and France, and Jefferson famously stooped to the ground and kissed the ground. They all cherished Shakespeare, as we do. Now, what I thought I'd do tonight is talk about two different aspects of Shakespeare that I love. I really love this stuff. So if I go too long, just wave me down. I've asked Rebecca to tell me when to stop. I wanted to talk about the comedies, First of all, because they're my greatest love, because I write plays that are, I try to write comedies. And then I wanted to talk briefly about how you can learn Shakespeare, how one approaches it if you're not already a Shakespearean. That's why I wrote this book. You'll see later how to teach your children Shakespeare, but it's really a stealth effort to say to people, here's how to learn Shakespeare if you're afraid of it or don't know it already. So those are the two things I want to talk about. So let's start by talking about the comedies. Now, in the catalog of the first folio, which is we know of as the we would call a table of contents, it shows that this was the first printing of all his plays at one time in 1623 after his death in 1616. It shows that he wrote 14 comedies, and these categories are pretty well held, 11 tragedies and 10 histories. A couple are missing from here. Pericles is missing. I think you'd put in probably into the comedy category. Now, what I want to ask tonight and examine is, what is it? How did he create them? What were his sort of internal rules? And what does he do to lift us up and make us laugh and make us cry and make us think and make us examine ourselves in a comic way, in a way that lifts us up, that obviously 2/3 of his output doesn't do? What is special about the comedies, and how did he do it? Classical comedy began in the 3rd century BC with a writer named Plautus. And Plautus invented a whole new form of theater, which came to be called the New Comedy, as opposed to Aristophanes, the Old Comedy. And Plautus wrote 130 plays, of which 20 survive. And these plays really are all the same in this sense. They follow a pattern. And the great critic Northrop Frye, the great Canadian critic, described that pattern this way. He said, the normal action of the plays is the effort of a young man to get possession of a young woman who is kept from him by various social barriers: her low birth, his minority, shortage of funds, parental opposition, remember that one, the prior claims of a rival, and that these are eventually circumvented, and the comedy ends at a point when a new society is crystallized, usually by the betrothal of the hero and heroine. Well, that sounds a little like Shakespeare, doesn't it? As well as every romantic comedy we've ever seen, from Katharine Hepburn to Cary Grant to Jennifer Aniston and Adam Sandler. Well, after Plautus and Terence, who was it wasn't his protege, because he was really actually a generation later, but Terence wrote in the style of Plautus. Stage comedy goes into hiding for 1,800 years until Shakespeare arrives in London around what we think is 1592-93 and writes the Comedy of Errors. And as you probably know, the Comedy of Errors is an adaptation of a Plautus play, the Menechmi twins, where instead of one set of twins, he has two sets of twins and doubles the comedy. What happens after Plautus? What happens in those 1,800 years? Why is there no comedy? Who knows? In the Middle Ages, they wrote things called morality and mystery plays, and these were not very funny. Moments of humor sort of shown through. And then in the 2 or 3 decades before Shakespeare, very primitive comedies were getting written. One called Ralph Royster Doyster, another called Gammer Gurton's Needle, things we sort of studied if we were English majors. And then, out of the blue, after these 1,800 years, comes this miracle of Shakespeare in the early 1590s. And he not only wrote comedies, but he established the pattern that comedies would then follow for the next 400 years, right up into our own times. Now, what do I mean by comedy? What is comedy in the Shakespearean sense? And from a critical standpoint, what were his concerns? And how did he create this newfangled genre? Well, what is comedy? In some ways, comedy can be defined as a play, and in Shakespeare's terms, this is really how you figure out which are the comedies, is a play that ends happily. Digging a little deeper, it's probably, it seems to me, a play that creates an environment where happy endings are inevitable. Well, now we're getting to the gist of what a Shakespeare comedy, because I think we can get even closer to what Shakespeare means by comedy if we look at three different elements of Shakespeare's comedy, starting with character. The thing to keep in mind about Shakespeare's characters, he created obviously dozens and dozens of these amazing creatures of a kind that never existed before. They never existed before on a stage. They never existed before in the English language. People who spoke to each other in colloquial discourse heightened by wit, intelligence, and poetry. In colloquial discourse, the way we're talking now, didn't happen on stage before that. Even the great Greek tragedies, not comedies, but tragedies, they didn't speak the way we speak to each other. They didn't hold conversations, and they certainly didn't do them in a sense of heightened discourse of wit, intelligence, and poetry. Certainly there was heightened discourse in the Greek tragedies, but they weren't colloquial. Let's listen to a character named Benedick. How many people know Much Ado About Nothing? Anybody here? Okay, great. Great, it's a lot of you. Much Ado About Nothing, one of the three great high comedies of Shakespeare, the so-called high comedies, which were his middle period. These are not, by the way, and interestingly, this table of contents is not in chronological order. If I knew why, once I forgot, has to do with the way books were printed at the time. Starts with The Tempest, his last play, but the great high comedies were Much Ado About Nothing, Twelfth Night, and As You Like It, his real middle of his period. So in Much Ado About Nothing, there are famously two characters, Benedick and Beatrice, who have a merry war going on between them. They're in love, but they don't want to admit it, and they're always sniping at each other and making fun of each other, and of course ultimately fall in love. Sort of sounds like all the great Hepburn, Tracy comedies we all love and everything since then. Well, here's what Benedick sounds like. He's sitting in a glade, and he has just learned that his protege, Claudio, has fallen in love, and supposedly was just as professed a bachelor as Benedick, has fallen in love and is about to get married. Here's what Benedick says. He says, "I do much wonder that one man, seeing how much another man is a fool when he dedicates his behaviors to love, will, after he hath laughed at such shallow follies in others, become the argument of his own scorn by falling in love. And such a man is Claudio. May I be so converted and see with these eyes? I cannot tell. I think not. One woman is fair, yet I am well. Another is wise, yet I am well. Another virtuous, yet I am well. But till all graces be in one woman shall not come in my grace. Rich she shall be, that's certain. Wise, or I'll none. Virtuous, or I'll never cheapen her. Fair, or I'll never look on her. Mild, or come not near me. Of good discourse, an excellent musician. And her hair shall be of what color it please God. Well, what more can I say? It's astonishing. It's astonishing. Out of the blue, nothing like this existed before. It revolutionized stagecraft. It revolutionized the English language. I went back and pulled out my old copy of Ralph Royster Doyster. Here are the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth lines of Ralph Royster Doyster. of 1567. And where is my trusty friend Matthew Merry Greek? I will make as I saw him not, he doth me seek. I have him espied, methinketh, yond is he. Huff, Matthew Merry Greek, my friend, a word with thee. He changed everything. This is Beatrice when she is talking about her desire to remain unmarried. What should I do with a husband? Dress him in my apparel and make him my waiting gentlewoman? He that hath a beard is more than a youth, and he that hath no beard is less than a man. He that is more than a youth is not for me, and he that is less than a man, I am not for him. It's night and day. And of course, it wasn't just Beatrice and Benedict that he created. It was dozens and dozens and dozens of other characters, Petruchio and Kate and Rosalind and Olivia and Violin and Titania and Pistol and Falstaff. Falstaff, the greatest talker in all of Shakespeare. These people speak in a common language that had never been heard before on stage. And the scholar Harold Bloom, who you probably know was at Harvard, I believe, but I know he's at Yale now, says and he's in his 90s and just came out with a new book last week on Falstaff, says in his book, Shakespeare and the Invention of the Human, that Shakespeare not only invented these characters, but in a way he invented us. Meaning that as we heard these characters speak on stage, we heard from inside ourselves our better selves, our more poetic selves, our more eloquent selves, and we tried to sound and act like them. So in a way, Shakespeare invented modern man and modern woman. There's a lot to say for it. That was character. Now let's take a look at the next piece of the puzzle, and let's turn to the stories that Shakespeare invented. And here it seems to me that Shakespeare was revolutionary in two different ways. First of all, he invented a set of tropes or themes that recur again and again in one play after another, and again we're using them to the present day. Some of these he invented out of whole cloth in his everyday discourse, seeing how people acted. Some he picked up from Chaucer. A couple of them, the boy meets girl plot, he took from Plautus. But here it seems to me, I count about 12 that he invented. Here's a few of them. The most important is the effort of the older generation to stand in the way of the sexual urge of the younger generation. The desire of parents to choose the husbands and wives of their children, saying, no, you can't have him, you can have her instead. Plautus used this as one of the social barriers in his pattern, but Shakespeare turned it into a sort of comic staple. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, within about 10 lines or 15 lines of the opening of the play, he has a character storm on stage named Aegeus, and he walks right up to Theseus, who is the Duke of Athens, the ruler. And Theseus says this, full of vexation come I. The point about this is that it opens the play. I mean, it sets the story of Midsummer Night's Dream right off the bat. What is the story going to be about? It's about a parent who doesn't want his daughter to marry this guy, he wants her to marry that guy. He says, full of vexation come I with complaint against my child, my daughter Hermia. Stand forth, Demetrius, my noble lord, that man hath my consent to marry her. Stand forth, Lysander, and my gracious Duke, this man hath bewitched the bosom of my child. Well, Shakespeare uses this same trope, the parent standing in the way of the children's desires, in play after play. We see it in Taming of the Shrew. We see it all the way to The Tempest, where his last play, where he has Prospero trying to arrange the marriage of his daughter Miranda. Another situation that recurs again, and as I say, I'll go through sort of 10 of them. I'll sort of speed up. Second one is a major situation is where people from the city, or the court, come to the countryside, and nature heals them. Nature in its healing, with its healing patterns, as in As You Like It, where Duke Sr. talks about there are books in the running brook and good in everything. That's that pattern, and we see it in As You Like It most obviously, but it's also in Midsummer Night's Dream I just talked about, which is where these lovers, after they're denied the right to marry who they want to marry, flee to a forest, and that forest, nature, happens to be a fairy forest filled with fairies, with Titania and Oberon and Puck. Third, country mice who go to the city for a day of adventure. 4, that witty sparring couple I talked about in Much Ado About Nothing. We see it again in Love's Labour's Lost and in other plays. 5, an old man who wants to marry a young wife. Falstaff in The Merry Wives of Windsor, only he wants two of them. Competing brothers, one good, one bad. Loving sisters, the servant who gets above himself. Twins who are separated and they're identical, and so they confuse everybody. Gender confusion and cross-dressing. We see that again and again in 5 of Shakespeare's comedies. Disguise, confusion, mistaken identity, these occur again and again. Now, these stories not only occur and recur in Shakespeare, they then recur in all the comedies, the classic comedies that come afterwards, in Congreve and Farquhar and Goldsmith and Sheridan and O'Keeffe and then Shaw and Wilde, Importance of Being Earnest. All these themes appear in The Importance of Being Earnest, and then Noel Coward. So Shakespeare set the tone. Now, there was a philosopher named Alfred North Whitehead who wrote a book called Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell in about 1910. And he defined art this way. He said that art is the imposing of a pattern on experience, and our aesthetic enjoyment is recognition of that pattern. Sounds a little complicated, but it's not. Art is you impose a pattern on experience, and when we see that pattern, we get aesthetic joy of recognizing the pattern. So, and arguably that's what makes these Shakespeare tropes so potent, because we see them again and again, and we recognize them from life, and then we also recognize them from literature. For example, we know that brothers often don't get along. Well, we see it in As You Like It at the very top, where Orlando and Oliver are arguing with each other. Then we see it in The Tempest, where the Duke of Milan and Prospero, who was the Duke of Milan, and his brother banishes him and sets him out to sea to drown with his daughter. And then we see it again in The School for Scandal. I mean, what's more obvious? I don't know how many of you know it's one of the great classic comedies of all time, but it's also all about Joseph and Charles Surface, and they're arguing with each other because they both want their uncle's inheritance. And then, of course, we see it in the great novelists. We see these tropes appear again and again in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. Who are Elizabeth and Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, but Beatrice and Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing? That's who they are, and that's where Jane Austen got them. The sisters in Pride and Prejudice, that trope really has its real guts coming out of As You Like It, where the two cousins, Celia and Rosalind, profess their love as if they were sisters. When Celia's father accuses Rosalind of being a traitor, Celia jumps to her defense and says, "If she be a traitor, why so am I. We still have slept together, rose at an instant, learned, played, ate together, and wheresoe'er we went, like Juno's swans, still we went coupled and inseparable." Well, there's Mary Ann Eleanor in Sense and Sensibility. There's characters from Emma. And not only Jane Austen, of course, knew her Shakespeare backwards and forwards, but so did Dickens, so did Mark Twain, and so did all the great novelists, so did Tolstoy. So I want to go now to the other way that Shakespeare, I think, revolutionized comedy. And what was let me put it better, that it is what was revolutionary about Shakespearean comedy. And interestingly, this is a thread that doesn't continue down the ages with other playwrights. It was sort of unique to Shakespeare, and that is that he always added something that was anti-realistic into every one of his comedies, something that was fantastical. In Midsummer Night's Dream, obviously, it's fairy. It's the fairy world and magic. In Twelfth Night, it's identical boy-girl twins. Such a thing can't exist. In Comedy of Errors, it's two sets of twins. In The Winter's Tale, it's a statue that comes to life after 30 years. Now, why did he do this? Why did he add something that was totally non-realistic into every one of his comedies? Who knows with a genius of this level, but it seems to me that what he is saying to the world when he does that is, behold, you must take these stories on faith as they are and believe in them wholeheartedly. You must use your imagination and not rely on mere reality to interpret your lives. The key is imagination and faith. So Paulina says in The Winter's Tale, when this statue, she's the servant, and when the statue of her mistress comes to life after 30 years, she says famously, it is required that you do awake your faith. And the friar in Much Ado About Nothing, when a hero seemingly dies because her husband husband-to-be on the altar accuses her of adultery, he says, let wonder seem familiar. All right, so we've had character, we've had story, and now let's talk about the third element I want to talk about tonight, which is the dramatic structure of Shakespeare's plays. And maybe this is a subject only a playwright could love, but bear with me, I think you'll find it interesting. It's, I came across a book maybe 20 years ago called Shakespeare's Game by a playwright named William Gibson, who wrote The Miracle Worker. He also taught a course at Harvard in Shakespeare, and then he memorialized that course in a book called Shakespeare's Game. And he talks, because being a playwright himself, he talks a lot about structure. And I wanted to sort of show you what I think is the structure of sort of every Shakespeare play, certainly the comedies. I know the others pretty well, but not as well as I know the comedies. And there's sort of 6 things that happen. One, I should have, if I'd known we had the whiteboard, and if I'd listened to Rebecca, I would have, I'd have put it up here. But the first is, we'll call the happening. The second one we'll call the opening moves. I will explain further. The third one is the spring at the center. The fourth is the barrier. This one really doesn't just sort of occur here, it occurs up here too. It starts to form itself up here. The fifth is my favorite, which is the third, what we'll call the third act pivot, because it usually occurs at the end of the third act. Shakespeare's plays are in 5 acts. It's not totally clear that he wrote them in 5 acts. When they were printed in the first folio, they were divided into 5 acts each by the editors, but that's because there was probably a jig or some kind of intermission at each place where we call the act breaks. And the sixth is the, what is, could be called the, well, it's the final hoo-ha. It is a nicer word than hoo-ha, is the crowning action. So here's how I think a Shakespeare play works, and particularly the comedies. The happening. What's the happening? Well, if you think about it, virtually all Shakespeare's plays open with some big event. And the event gets our attention. It's there to get our attention. Plays don't exist in equipoise. They don't exist because things are static. They exist because something is out of joint. And also, it's a way to get our attention. You know, we're not there to be bored. We're there because it should be exciting. So Romeo and Juliet opens with a street brawl, a really exciting, vulgar street brawl. The Tempest opens with a ship at sea that's going under, and people are screaming, save the ship, save the ship. Twelfth Night opens with a ship at sea that goes down. It's the second scene. Sometimes it'll be isn't always at the very first line. King Lear opens in almost 25 lines in with Lear dividing his country between his children. It doesn't always have to be fisticuffs, but it's something that is exciting that gets our attention. That's sort of the happening. Then come the opening moves. What do I mean by the opening moves? What I mean is that he writes scenes that require a reaction. It creates sort of like a little ping pong match, and so it moves us from one scene to the next and one action to the next. Take Hamlet, because I think we all know it best. Hamlet opens, well, here we have a great happening, one of the great happenings of all time in Hamlet, which is that a ghost appears. A ghost appears in the first scene, and it scares the bejesus out of the two guys who are standing guard. So what happens? They tell Horatio. Horatio tells Hamlet. You can say, well, there's going to be a reaction from Hamlet. Hamlet says, I have to go see the ghost. Hamlet goes to the battlements in scene 4. Hamlet sees the ghost. Angels and ministers of grace defend us. The ghost tells him he's been murdered and to avenge his foul and most unnatural murder. Back and forth it goes, one scene after another, based on what's happened. In As You Like It, Orlando and his brother fight. Oliver fight. In the very first scene, have a match. They're trying to beat the crap out of each other because they're so angry at each other because Oliver is trying to keep Orlando low and not give him his inheritance. So what happens? He hires a wrestler to kill Orlando at the wrestling match. What happens then? You go to the wrestling match. He meets Rosalind. What happens there? Rosalind falls in love with Orlando. What happens after that? Each one, they're like little energy systems that Shakespeare creates within each plot so that they start having an internal energy and start moving along. The spring at the center, the third piece. By the time you get about a third of the way through the play, a Shakespeare play, in any good play, you have to know who are the protagonists and what is at stake. What's at stake? If you cut out every other line in the play, you couldn't cut out the lines that tell this story. In Hamlet it's will Hamlet kill the king? The ersatz king. Will he kill Claudius? Will Hamlet kill the king? In Twelfth Night, it's will Viola ever find her brother Sebastian and be reunited with her twin brother, who she's so deeply invested in and misses so much? We find out well before this point in the story that, yeah, Sebastian's alive because we get to see him walking around Illyria, but she doesn't. Will she ever find out? In As You Like It, it's really, in most of the comedies in one way or the other, is will boy get girl or will girl get boy? They are really, boy and girl meet each other, boy and girl fall in love, boy loses girl, and will boy get girl back, and so on. So that's the spring at the center. Some people would say that's the different in play, people who teach playwriting, you know, identify that as, I don't know, they have other words for it, but that's what's going on there. And with Shakespeare, you always know that about a third of the way through. Now, the other thing that Shakespeare does that's really remarkable is he always sets up a barrier to the fulfillment of what the characters want. What do I mean? Well, in Hamlet, it's Hamlet's in... Look, why doesn't Hamlet just go stab Claudius? It's because of his indecision. It's because he's a contemplative guy who sees all sides of the problem at the same time, and he really, you know, really thinks about it. There's a wonderful remark by it might be Bloom, but I forget who it is. Might be Greenblatt, who's at Harvard, who's maybe the greatest Shakespearean living, which is that if Hamlet had had Othello's disposition, he'd have killed Claudius at the end of the first act, and the play would be over. And if Othello had Hamlet's contemplative disposition, he never would ever never strangle Desdemona. He'd figure out that Iago is fooling him by the end of Act 2. So, you know, character and plot are really obviously closely allied, but I wrote down some of the barriers here. I want to give you a good eye. Well, in Midsummer Night's Dream, why don't the lovers get together right away? Why don't they just fall into each other? They fled into the forest. They don't have to worry about the father. What keeps them apart? What does Shakespeare invent? And this is really, I think about this a lot because it's a question of what do you invent to make the story keep working? Often it's artificial, but you've got to come up with something clever. Well, in Shakespeare, it's the magic flower. How many people know Midsummer Night's Dream at all? Anybody? Yeah, most of you do. Which is that as Oberon describes it to Puck, the juice of it on sleeping eyelids laid will make or man or woman madly dote upon the next live creature that it sees. It's a flower, you put it on their eyes, they're asleep, you open up and you fall in love with the next person. So they keep falling in love with the wrong people. So that's what it is in Midsummer Night's Dream. What is it in As You Like It and Twelfth Night Cheers, this and Two Gentlemen of Verona, and to some extent Merchant of Venice, is that women dress up as boys. And as some critics put it cleverly, is that in a sense the whole plot is the clothing. If Rosalind changes back into women's clothes, the play's over. And that could have happened in Act 3. The fact that she stubbornly decides to play a joke and dress like a boy, and Orlando, through some anti-realistic magic, doesn't recognize that this is Rosalind, how on earth would you not? You keep the play going. You change the costume, which is the barrier, and the play is over. All right, let's talk about the third act pivot. Third act pivot is kind of the coolest one. The third act pivot, again, if you're writing a play, you got to think about what's going to happen towards the end of Act 3 of a 5-act structure. If it's a 3-act play, it's probably towards the end of Act 2. It's about 2/3 of the way through. That changes everything. What action probably spells the final result of the play? Will Hamlet kill the king, or will he destroy himself in the process? And in Hamlet, it's when he kills Polonius. It's usually some violent or in any case, out-of-the-box action that changes everything. Will Hamlet kill the king is the question, and he kills Polonius by accident, thinking it's the king behind the arrest, and at that point, Hamlet's doomed. He's either going to end up killing Claudius, or he's going to perish trying. Let me give you a few other great third act pivots. Well, in Romeo and Juliet, it's another killing. It's when Romeo kills Tybalt. Romeo and Juliet, they want to get married, they fall in love, but there's a fight again in Act 3, and in the fight, Tybalt, who's been against the marriage because these two houses, he's a part of the house of Juliet's Capulet house. He has a fight. Tybalt kills Mercutio, and Romeo gets so mad he kills Tybalt. Well, once he kills her cousin, he's banished forever from Verona, and clearly now this is not going to end happily. But the interesting thing is that in comedies, the third act pivot doesn't always tell you how it's going to end. Sometimes the third act pivot occurs in a comedy, and actually it still ends happily, even though that's disruptive in a sort of negative way. So Much Ado About Nothing, there's a big wedding between Hero, coming up between Hero and Claudio, and Claudio's been given false information, denounces his bride at the altar. She faints. It appears that she's dead. There's craziness. Well, there's two plots. In this plot, not about Beatrice and Benedict, but about Claudio and Hero, will they find happiness? Well, yeah, they do at the end. They do, because it's a comedy. And in a comedy, comedies are looser than tragedies. They kind of go off in odd little ways towards the end because they're seeking this kind of happy ending. So that's what the third act pivot is. And then comes the crowning action. The crowning action in most Shakespeare comedies, of course, is a wedding or a betrothal. In The Taming of the Shrew, it's the banquet. If you know the banquet at the end from the great Burton Elizabeth Taylor movie, if you've ever seen it. It's a banquet at the end where each husband is going to see whether his wife will listen to him, and Kate, who has been such a firebrand, is tested at the end. Each of the three wives is tested, and it's Kate who actually by this time has indeed fallen in love with Petruchio. So at the end of the play, there's a big wedding, or there's a feast, or there's a banquet, or a betrothal that ends the piece with a pop, if you will. And that's sort of how a Shakespeare play works from beginning to end. Now, how am I doing on time? What am I? Oh, good. Okay, it's 1:15. Oh, great. Okay, good. Perfect. What I thought, I want to shift just for a second into what do you do if you don't know? I mean, Shakespeare for a lot of people is frightening. It's scary. It sounds scary. And it sounds like we can't understand it when we first hear it, so we shy away from it. So most people don't know Shakespeare, and they're not Shakespeareans. But I want to solve that. What happened in my case was my daughter, when she was little, came home from first grade, came home spouting a line of Shakespeare, because her teacher had taught her a line of Shakespeare in first grade, and I thought to myself, ooh, this is good. Maybe I can take all this love of Shakespeare and do something with it. You certainly can't make a living from it. So we sat down and we spent an hour on Saturdays and an hour on Sundays learning Shakespeare. But what I mean by learning Shakespeare is she memorized passages of Shakespeare. I had her memorize passages of Shakespeare. And she loved it. And it seems to me that and then I did it with my son, it seems to me that's the way to learn Shakespeare, whether you're a kid or whether you're an adult. So let's look, in your packets, does everybody have a packet? In your packets, I thought we'd just have one fun experiment, because here's the things you've got to do. If anybody doesn't, let's get it, okay? And one of the pages in your packet is what you see on screen, which is the opening lines of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, if you read those in a book, you would read, "Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. 4 happy days bring in another moon. But oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes. She lingers my desires like to a stepdame or a dowager long withering out a young man's revenue." And you would say, what the hell does that mean? You know, it's almost hard to parse. But the key to learning Shakespeare, what the book does, I hope you buy the book, but whether you do or not, do the same thing, is what the book does is it takes short passages from Shakespeare and says, here's the ones you can teach your children, or here's the ones that you can learn yourself. And we start with some easy, there's 25 passages in the book, and I explain them at length and fit them into the stories, so you learn all the stories of Shakespeare and the characters. And then I list 150 others at the end, because we went through hundreds together with the kids. And my daughter went off to college knowing 1,000 lines of Shakespeare. Is easier passages than harder passages. And you've got to know what every single word means, and you've got to know why the characters are saying it. And if you know those four things, know what every word means. I'll talk about iambic pentameter. You don't have to know that, but sort of how the verse works in a second. You have to know them fluently. You have to be able to, you teach the kids or teach yourself to the point of absolute fluency. Titania, when she argues with Oberon. These are the forgeries of jealousy, and never since the middle summer spring met we on hill and dale, forest or mead, by pavy fountain or by rushy brook, or in the beached margin of the sea, to dance our ringlets to the whistling wind. But with thy brawls thou hast disturbed our sport. If you know these things at the tip of your tongue, you won't forget them. You will, they'll become part of you, and you'll understand them in a different way. And then when you go to see a Shakespeare play, when they get to that passage, when you hear Viola say, make me a willow cabin at her gate and call upon my soul within the house, you'll go, oh, I know that passage. I know what that means. And if I do, even if I'm a little confused about other things, you don't need to know every single word of a Shakespeare play. It's like opera. You let it roll over you. When you get there, you go, oh, I know that passage. I know that one. So let's together try to learn at least, let's talk about this passage. We have about 10 minutes, right? Yeah. Then we could have questions, but I can take questions up there. So it opens with a duke, with two people getting married who are obviously very high born. It's the Duke of Athens, and the queen he's going to marry is who was the queen of the Amazons, named Hippolyta. He's conquered them. He says, opening lines, now fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. Fair means beautiful. Nuptial means having to do with weddings. Hour means time of day, and they, obviously in ancient times, when this is supposedly set, used the sun and the moon, that's going to be important in a second here, to measure time. But he says, now, beautiful bride-to-be, Hippolyta, our wedding, the moment of our wedding is coming quickly, draws on apace. Now, Hippolyta, our wedding will happen in no time at all. Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. So let's try it. So if you were sitting together one night with your spouse or with your kids, you'd say, you need to repeat the passages, and just repeat them till you memorize them. So let's try it. Repeat after me. Now, fair Hippolyta. Now, fair Hippolyta. Now, fair Hippolyta. One more time. Now, fair Hippolyta. Our nuptial hour. Our nuptial hour. Our nuptial hour. Our nuptial hour. Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour. Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour. Draws on apace. 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 Okay. Now I'm going to say the whole line. Where does it end? Yes. I'm going to talk about iambic pentameter. And the way I used this sheet, because this is how I did it with my kids, is draws on apace for happy deeds bring in is one line of Shakespeare, but I broke it down to the next line, and we did notebooks and notebooks where I typed these in Comic Sans to make them easier for the kids to read. But now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace is the first line and a half. So I'm going to say it, and then you can always glance. You can always keep glancing, but keep repeating. I'll say it, and you say it, then you say it. Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. Great, great. Now, every time you go to see Midsummer Night's Dream and it opens, you say, I know where I am, and I've done something that's familiar to myself. Let's keep going. Let's explain the rest of it, depending on the time we have. 4 happy days bring in another moon. Well, in 4 days, they're going to get married, right? 4 happy days bring in another moon. Why does it moon? Well, because that's how they measured time. And it means that the moon, they know from whether the moon is full or has waned how they measure the month. So they use the moon. 4 happy days bring in another moon. 4 happy days bring in another moon. But I'll explain it first. But oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes. Listen to those oh sounds. They sound like they're yearning. He can't wait to jump in bed with this queen of his because they're about to get married. But oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes. But oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes. Shakespeare is always telling us how to say his verse. He's always telling us where to stop and pause. He's always telling us how each word is to be pronounced. Let me give you a tip. I don't have a watch because it broke, so I'll just keep going. Tell me when it's 7. Okay. Iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is the basic verse form that Shakespeare wrote in. It's iambic, and iamb is the dumb. The dumb. That's a sound that we call an iamb. And pentameter means 5. There's 5. So a Shakespeare verse line is da-dum, 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 da-dum. If music be the food of love, play on, the opening line of Twelfth Night. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. But what he does is he plays jazz on that rhythm. It's like a 12-tone row in blues. He plays jazz on the rhythm. So he tells us that Hippolyta, interestingly, there are 10 beats, 5 times 2, da-dum, in that opening line, and you'd have to say it, now fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour. Now fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour, but we don't. We say, now fair Hippolyta. Tells us that he's making a speech, that he's getting our attention, that right from the beginning, he's telling us slowly, now fair Hippolyta. Hippolyta has four syllables, but it's done in a single beat. So that's how you say the word Hippolyta. Now, it's not Hippolyta, it's not Hippolyta, it's Hippolyta. Now fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour. Now after that, he goes right back into regular iambic pentameter. Draws on apace, for happy days bring in another moon, but oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes. So it's clear that that opening line has to be spoken differently. Now fair, because he never tells you to speak things that are nonsensical. Now fair Hippolyta, And he makes you pause after Hippolyta. Whether he had that comma there or not wouldn't matter. And of course, we don't really know too much about his punctuation, because when the typesetters set it up in 1623, they didn't have good, reliable manuscripts, so they stuck it in there because it sounded like it should be there. But in fact, it does sound like it should be there. Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. So let's say that again. Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. Let me say the next one, you say it. For happy days bring in another moon, but oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes. This old moon wanes sounds yearning. Now let's look at the final phrase. It's very odd. She lingers my desires like to a stepdame or a dowager long withering out a young man's revenue. He says, it's really something. He uses linger in a way that's never been used before. Normally you might say someone lingers at a doorway. It's not that somebody lingers your desire, but Shakespeare was always making up words. And one of the handouts, I forgot to tell you, one of the handouts in there is, one of the pages is a wonderful passage by Bernard Levin, who was at Harvard for years, a great Shakespeare scholar, which is all the phrases that Shakespeare makes up. Not all of them, because he makes up lots more. And you'll have fun taking that home. And I also included a great passage from Virginia Woolf I love about her and Shakespeare. So she lingers my desires. She makes me wait and wait. Like an old woman or a dowager, someone of great revenue, as he says elsewhere, someone of great wealth. And one of the kids who goes into the forest is going to see his aunt, by the way, who is very rich, who he thinks will take care of him. She lingers my desires like to a stepdame or a dowager, long withering out a young man's revenue. Meaning, isn't going to give the money to the kid till she dies. And the kid has to wait and wait till this old lady dies to get the money he's waiting for. Oh, methinks how slow the old moon. Moon is always a woman in Shakespeare in those times. In Renaissance times, the moon was the female orb. The old moon wanes, waiting till it wanes and the 4 days are over. She lingers my desires like to a stepdame or a dowager, long withering out a young man's revenue. Odd metaphor in the opening line of Midsummer Night's Dream, but it's all about families. It's all about old men saying you can't marry who you want. And who knows whatever Shakespeare's up to in his mad genius. Let's say the whole passage one last time, then we'll call it quits. I don't know if I'll have time for any questions, and then we'll go up and I'll see you upstairs. Let's do it together. You ready? Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace, for happy days bring in another moon, but oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes. She lingers my desires like to a stepdame or a dowager, long withering out a young man's revenue. Great, thank you very much. Great. Do we have time for questions? Oh, anybody want to ask any questions? Shoot.
My question is about Shakespeare and Moliere.
Okay.
So you believe Moliere was a French Shakespeare, and he did comedies, he did histories, he did tragedies, and I think they were contemporaries.
Moliere was, what are Moliere, who has their phone with them? Who works down here? Moliere is a little later. A little bit later.
Do you think that he could have been influenced?
Well, I'm sure there's books about it. I don't, that's a wonderful. The question was, if anybody didn't hear it, is what about Moliere? He wrote tragedies as well as Tragic comedies in a way, and certainly comedies. Comedy was his great thing. Did he ever write any history plays? I don't know. He certainly wrote some based on myth, Andromeda. Did he know Shakespeare's plays? He was a little later. And the answer is, I don't know. That's a great question, and I'm sure there have been books about it. You didn't know English? Well, you know, Shakespeare was translated, but I don't know if he was even translated that early. When I go to France, I always pick up different translations to see. I read enough French, I sort of figure it out. And a little bit of Italian, I do it, but I don't know well enough. But great question.
2 questions, a quick one. Is first grade when you sort of recommend?
First grade is when I started my daughter.
And then the second question is, I have a lot of trouble when I see Shakespeare perform because I hear these passages, incredible use of words and language, and I begin to try to understand them and think about them, and then the thought moves on. And I'm just wondering, when you go see Shakespeare performed, are you listening for the language, or are you going to follow the plot, or does it depend on the performance?
And for those who don't know, because it's being recorded up here, when you go to a Shakespeare play, it goes by so fast, you listen to the plot, or you listen to the language, or the performance. And it's another great question, because first of all, I think the best way to approach it, if you're not already a Shakespearean and know them, is read a plot synopsis to begin with. Go in knowing the story. That'll really help you, because often the stories are confusing at the beginning because we can't understand the language right off the bat. I'm usually sort of doing both. I'm trying to remember the story, get the tone of the piece, pick up some of the language, try to have read. Most good synopses will probably have had little excerpts, of 4 lines here and there. Read a synopsis that has enough guts to it, that has some, not just what they give you in the playbill for that's, a half a page. Before you go, these days on the internet, just go to Wikipedia and read a good synopsis of the play, and then try to follow the story and see if there's any language that you can pick up that informs you and moves you. One of the passages, it's so moving and it's so tremendous and it changes your life. One of the passages in the book I talk about a lot is in Twelfth Night, where this woman named Olivia, who is the queen of all she surveys, she owns a big estate, is being wooed by the guy in the neighboring estate named Orsino, and he's getting nowhere with her. Well, Orsino sends a messenger, sends one of his servants, a little boy named Cesario. Well, that boy isn't really a boy, it's really a girl, and it's Viola, the heroine of the whole play, who's dressed up as a boy. And she keeps saying, so she goes there, she being Cesario, who's really a girl, and says to Olivia, who's a girl, "Why can't you love my master? He adores you. Why don't you give him a chance? In your denial, I would find no sense. I do not understand it," she says. And Olivia turns to her and says, "Well, why? What would you do?" Doesn't say the word do. She leaves out the word do. It's a better line. She says, "Why? What would you?" And Viola says what she would do if she was in love. And it's just 8 lines, and it's one of the ones you should memorize for sure. And it's, "What would you do?" She says, "Make me a willow cabin at your gate." Willow is the symbol of melancholy and weeping and disappointment. "Make me a willow cabin at your gate and call upon my soul within the house." My soul, does she mean her own soul, or does she mean Olivia's soul? "Call upon my soul within the house. Write loyal cantons of contemned love." A canton is just a song. I'd write songs and halloo them, she says. So, "Make me a willow cabin at your gate and call upon my soul within the house. Write loyal cantons of contemned love and sing them loud even in the dead of night. Halloo your name." She uses the word Actually, it's written Hallow, hallow your name. We think it's probably she means call your name. Halloo your name even in the dead of night, and make the babbling gossip of the air cry out, Olivia! Well, Olivia's just gobsmacked. She goes, whoever this is, man or woman, I'm in love with that creature. Who could say that? Make me a willow cabinet at your gate, and call upon my soul within the house. Write loyal cantons of contemned love, and sing them loud even in the dead of night. Halloo your name to the reverberate hills, and make the babbling gossip of the air cry out, Olivia! Oh, you should not rest between the elements of air and earth, but you would pity me. At that point, she said, oh my God. So when you're listening, if you find a little passage that's special, have that in your mind when you go. Watch for it. That occurs in the second act, so you're partway through the play. You know the plot. You hear the language. You listen to the language. So do them all at once, but do them at the level you're ready to do them. Now, if anybody has to go, go.
I teach Shakespeare to 8th graders.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, when you said about having your children memorize Shakespeare, what did you do or say to convince them that this is a good idea?
So she says she teaches 8th graders Shakespeare. Teaches 8th grade, and they teach them Shakespeare. And what did I do to convince my kids in the 1st grade to do it? Well, first of all, when they're in 1st grade and they're 6, 7 years old, they're more malleable. If daddy and mommy are doing it and it looks like fun, they'll sit together and do it. Second of all, I just think by showing them enthusiasm and playing them recordings and watching funny parts on TV and loving it yourself so much, they just get on the bandwagon. I'll agree, 8th graders, you're talking about 14-year-olds, right? 13, 14-year-olds, they can be skeptical and hard to get onto the bandwagon, but just keep fighting. Just show them how much you love it. All right, so I think we should stop now and go upstairs. Thank you again.